Right. Welcome, everyone, to this episode of In Conservation With. My name is David Lindo, and with me tonight is an old friend of mine, actually. His name is Matt Young, all the way from the States. I'll give you a very top-line sort of overview of Matt. He's the executive director and founder of the Finch Research Network, otherwise known as FIRN, which is soon to be launched. And he used to work with many people, actually, including the Cornell University, but I'll actually break that down in a minute. But firstly, let me introduce Matt. Matt, how are you? Thanks for coming today.
I'm good. Thank you. I appreciate you, having me on today. And hello, everybody.
Hi.
I'm good. I'm very good.
I have to get Caroline or Carolyn even. Carolyn. Sorry, Carolyn, to put your mic in mute. Where are you?
I am in Cortland, New York, which is upstate New York, about 4.5 hours from New York City. So I am not at the epicenter, fortunately, of this COVID thing that we're all navigating right now.
So what's it like? Are you actually still in lockdown, or what's it like at the moment?
New York State has had some of the strictest regulations, but we are in these phased openings, and we are now basically have reopened most of the state except for New York City, parts of New York City. And my area only has, there's only like 40 confirmed cases in my county, just to give you perspective compared to New York City.
It's funny because I went to visit Matt about 6 or 7 years ago, and I didn't realize just how big America was, because I landed in Newark airport in New York, and Matt said, yes, it's a few hours drive to his house. And I thought, a few hours? 5.5 hours later, I roll up at his house, and I was still in New York State. And I was thinking, wow, this place is a big place.
Yeah, if you were to drive diagonally across the state from New York City to Buffalo, that's a good 9 hours, probably.
Wow.
Yeah, 10 hours.
That's incredible. You've been enjoying birds and nature since you were a very young age, and you've lived in New York, central New York, for the past 22 years, apart from obviously living where you are now near Ithaca. And during this time, you started studying everything from birds to orchids even, bogs and fens. When you actually started your interest in natural history, what happened? As my American friends always say, did you have a spark moment, or did you just were born that way?
It's an interesting story in that, I never had one of those major influences at a really young age. So, but my interest in natural history was always there. My mom loves to tell this story all the time now about me when we moved to the country when I was 5 years old, about how I would be pointing out bugs and wanting to pick strawberries and stuff like that. So, that was kind of the beginnings of my interest in nature. I originally started as a meteorology, water resources undergraduate. That's where I got my undergraduate degree. But, my real spark moment where I kind of knew, all right, where my life started to shift was when I took a job in Yellowstone National Park right after I finished my undergraduate degree. And I remember two things, actually. I was at Upper Falls in Yellowstone, and I had a flock of red crossbills fly over as I was looking at a black-backed woodpecker. And I was just new to birding at that point. This was like 1995, so I was 25 years old when I started to really become a hardcore birder, slash the beginning of my field ornithology career. And that was the spark moment from there. And, I realized I had a bit of a gift for being able to identify birds by sound. And it just started, my whole worldview started to shift as almost anybody you probably interviewed, David, that, there's that spark moment, and life is never the same again after that spark moment.
You're telling me. So you received your BS. BS is
Bachelor's in science.
okay. Bachelor's in Science in Water Resources with the minor in Meteorology from sunny.
Oneonta. So
that's weird. Anyway,
I'm sorry.
But you've had such a variety of different situations. I mean, you did your master's research on avian diversity in restored wetlands in central New York at the Great Swamp Conservancy. Then you were the regional editor of Kingbird, which is a state ornithological journal in New York, for 10 years. You were adjunct professor in environmental studies in Cortland, in SUNY Cortland, and you currently teach an intro to birding class for Cornell University. Plus, you are the chair at the Wetland Trust. You have project led on the Cornell Lab's first winter finch eruptive bird survey for Bird Source in 1998, and did extensive field work for the lab's cerulean and golden wing warblers atlas projects as well. I mean, it goes on. You've done quite a lot of stuff. I'll tell you what. Let's cut to the chase. Obviously, you are a very rounded ornithologist. When did the interest in finches start with you, or was it again always there?
It mainly started when I was, Yellowstone, and then I took a position in a program called AmeriCorps, which is a domestic-based Peace Corps program. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that, but I took a position in Washington State in the Cascades, near Mount St. Helens, Mount Adams, and it was there where it took off. I mean, it was coniferous forest, quite a few crossbills, quite a few evening grosbeaks, quite a few pine siskins. I mean, I remember snowshoeing about 5.5 miles in the Cascades when I was in this AmeriCorps program, again, which was a kind of a domestic-based Peace Corps program. Still exists today, but a bit different than in '95, which was his first full year. But I would snowshoe into these carnivore camera sets to see if we could get pictures monitoring for Canada lynx and fisher, which is a mustelid, a weasel. And I just remember seeing these swirling flocks of siskins and crossbills on these hikes, and they kind of became my, they were my go-to species when you're in these coniferous forests in western United States. The diversity is not really high because you're in a coniferous forest. But it was something I could rely on every one of these hikes, as I would see finches over and over and over and over. And I just, I'm a bit of a social cat myself, and finches are social. So they just, my interest from there on just took off.
Well, I've had the pleasure of going birding with you a couple of times in the last 8 years or so. And whenever I think of birding with you, I think of very freezing temperatures. And I also think of you wearing an open neck shirt and what seemed like a light jacket, whereas I've got every piece of clothing known to man on, and I'm freezing. Like I have to go back to the car every 10 minutes. So you've got a very high kind of impervity to cold.
Yeah, I do. I've always, my again, I run kind of hot, warm, and I don't like heat at all. I mean, we're experiencing 85-degree weather now in New York, and I don't seem to really, experience a lot of cold when I'm out in the conditions. Now, as I've gotten a little bit older, that has changed a little bit. But it's funny you bring that up. That a couple days ago, I had a friend of mine when I posted this to my Facebook wall that I was going to be doing this interview with you. They laughed out loud. They privately emailed me or texted me, and they commented about how comical the photo of you and I are or is, in that you're completely covered, and here I have I'm not even fully buttoned up. There's snow all over us.
The thing is that there was a problem because I was actually sick because I was traveling across the States over a period of 6 weeks. I went from hot to cold, and I caught this flu in California. And by the time I got to your side of the world, it's freezing cold. And actually, by the time I got back to California, I went to a doctor in Beverly Hills. I was forced to go to a doctor in Beverly Hills, and I was really dreading it, thinking it's going to cost me like $900, which I didn't have. It actually cost $80, but he actually told me that I was this far away from pneumonia. So I was pretty ill. That's probably why I was suffering in the cold so much. I'm
sorry about that. I dragged you out that day, but it was a pretty epic day, and one we'll never forget. That's for sure.
Absolutely. So tell us about finches. I mean, when I think about finches, I'm thinking about birds with conical bills. But then I look in the field guides and I see buntings and I see tanagers and I see other things with conical bills that aren't finches. And I think, when is a finch like a sparrow? When is a finch not a finch? So what defines a finch?
Oh man, that's a I don't know if that is a question that is fully resolved to some degree with the taxonomic changes that have taken place over time. And you're right. I mean, we all kind of think of, and so the finches that I'm mainly interested in are the fringillid finches, which they call the true finches, Fringillidae. And you think of these conical bills, like hawfinch and evening grosbeak here in the States, and crossbills, although crossbills are a very unique bill, obviously. But the interesting thing is we have a bunch of grosbeaks here in the States that aren't apparently related to the fringillid finches, even though they look the same and they have the same bill. So I think that, the idea of what is a finch is becoming more and more just genetically, these genetic tests that are coming out, studies that are coming out, and less based on the morphological species concept that we all kind of a lot of us grew up with. I shouldn't say all of us follow, but we used to do the morphological species concept, and if a bird had this kind of shaped bill, and another bird species had a shaped bill, they had to be related. Well, now we're finding that it's a more dynamic situation than we once thought. I mean, look at the honey creepers. I don't know if people are familiar with honey creepers. The story of honey creepers in Hawaii, though that speciation event started from a flock of rose finches from Europe, from Eurasia, common rose finches that got blown off, path, landed in Hawaii, and then they adaptively radiated in Hawaii into 56 different species. And some of the bills that evolved out of that speciation event looked almost like long, larger, long versions of a hummingbird bill. So it's kind of a tricky situation. And now there's only about 20 or 18 of those species in, the honey creepers. Only about 18 of them still exist today, unfortunately. A lot of anthropogenic kind of dynamics that have occurred in Hawaii, that there's not a lot of native species that are thriving there anymore.
So let's look at a common rosefinch, or a common rosefinch type bird, ended up in Hawaii and radiated out into honey creepers.
Yeah, 56 different species of honey creepers. One flock, a mixed flock of what they believe is common rose finches. I think it was 4 or 5 million years ago, landed there, and then he adaptively radiated out into 56 species. One of the most amazing speciation events ever kind of documented. That's what they think the linkage is to common rosefinch flock. And it's kind of a Galapagosy finch kind of dynamic, which, those aren't fringillate finches, believe it or not, the Galapagos finches, even though they have the common name finch. They now believe they're more closely related to tanagers, which, have a bill that is somewhat similar to a lot of, what we kind of have grown up believing are finches, for cracking seeds.
Yeah, so tell us more about finches then. So your classic finch, how does that differ from, a bunting or a tanager or sparrow? What are the main, maybe morphological differences?
Again, the morphological differences seem to be pretty slight across these groups. It's derived from these new genetic studies. The fringillate finches are largely cold weather species, and they're social in behavior. Whereas, some of your buntings and sparrows aren't nearly as social, at least here in the States. They're not. But it's really that social aspect that makes finches pretty unique in a lot of ways. A lot of the finches have flight calls. And that's what I've really kind of studied and made my name in a lot of ways the last 20-something years now, studying crossbill flight calls.
Okay.
I'm sorry I didn't answer. Again, it's a more complex landscape than just morphological differences. When you have a rose-breasted grosbeak in the United States and then an evening grosbeak, and you look at them, they almost look structurally the same, and you go, they got to be related, but they're not closely related.
Okay. Okay, tell us about the calls then. I mean, obviously, you've been doing a big study on calls. I mean, one of the main issues, certainly in the UK and in Europe, is this whole complex with the redpolls and crossbills. In Britain, we have supposedly 3 species of crossbill that are kind of regular, in inverted commas. I mean, you've got the common crossbill, which I suppose you guys call the red crossbill. We've got the parrot crossbill. I'm not sure if that shows up in America. And then we've got the Scottish crossbill, the Scottbill, which I don't believe exists. I don't know anyone that's ever seen one really. What's the situation with the crossbills, for example? How does that all work?
Yeah, it's interesting when you say, I don't know if the Scottish crossbill exists because I've never seen one. So to actually identify the red crossbill or common crossbill complex, you have to audio record them. And so people will send me recordings from around the world, and I will identify these based on audio spectrographic analysis of the signature of the bird's flight call. And that's how they came up with Scottish crossbill. And sometimes people joke about, the dialect of the Scottish crossbill as leading to the speciation or the description of that species. And it's obviously one of the more controversial species in the world, the Scottish crossbill. But so when crossbills fly over, so it's a little bit 2 different. Let me just describe the landscape for you on the red crossbill, common crossbill dynamic. In the States here, we have about 11 different flight calls in North America, I should say. And, they are described as ecotypes in that each one of the flight calls flies over, making this different flight call. And there's an implied ecological specialization with that flight call. And there's slightly different bill sizes for each one of those flight calls. And each one of them is most efficient at feeding on certain conifer species. So again, there's this kind of adaptive radiation going on in these call types with certain different ecological specializations being implied. 3 years ago, type 9, red crossbill in the States here in North America, was elevated to species status. It was a new species was described called the cache crossbill, only found in one county in Idaho in 2 isolated mountain ranges. Now, in Eurasia and Europe, they haven't really, the literature, and I don't really know where the truth is in this, but the diversification of conifers is lower in Europe than it is here in North America. So these ecotypes and these ecological specializations, there's been a lot of research done by Dr. Craig Bankman at the University of Wyoming, and Tom Hahn and Jeff Groth. Jeff Groth is the one that originally described the call type phenomenon. Now, there's call types in Europe, but they aren't really, they have not been able to figure out whether these are just kind of dialects or whether they're actually tied to a core area with a unique suite of conifer species. And so they're not sure if there's this ecological thing going on across the pond as compared to here in North America. Now, is that just because the science hasn't caught up over there yet? It's an ongoing, evolving landscape. Whereas over here, we've been fortunate to have kind of a handful of us loxiophiles, we call them. So the Latin name for crossbills, Loxia curvirostra. Here in the States, we have 40 years of really good research that's been going on. Let me see, 40 years? It really started in the early 80s, so almost 40 years of published papers, tying certain call types to certain areas of North America, and then foraging efficiency studies being done. And again, that's mostly been Dr. Bankman's kind of contribution, major contribution of this. Where I've come in is again, I get recordings, every day I get recordings from somewhere in the world of like, hey, can you identify this call type? And so I've become, the leader on describing these call types and determining whether this is a type 1 or a type 3 or a type A or a type C. So you kind of have a lettering system over there, and we have a numbering system here. I know that's a long answer, but I hope everybody could follow that.
So basically, are you saying that some of the crossbills, type A or type 1, would not breed with type 3, for example? Does it work that way?
Sorry, I missed the end of your question there. You faded out on me a little bit.
Does your research show you that, say, type A or type 1 crossbills would not mix, for example, with type 4 or type D crossbills?
So yeah, the idea is because there's this implied ecological specialization, like call type wants to mate with like call type because of that ecological specialization. Because if you're a small bill crossbill, say again in North America here, type 3 is a small billed bird, is most common in western hemlock forests on the Pacific coast, the northwest area of North America, and you mate with a large billed crossbill, it's not a good fit because you might not forage as efficient as your mate. And so again, the idea is, like call type wants to mate with like call type, and that's really one of the things I am most interested in, is doing an assortative mating study on these call types. So I'm in the process in collaboration with Cornell, putting out ARU units, which are these automated recording units, to try to get some pilot data for densities and diversities of call types in certain areas of North America to see where you could actually then maybe put some biologists on the ground, and they could go out and record them, and then actually see, in an area where you have a diversity of call types and a density of them, and see, are they making correct choices and mating with the right call type. 2 years ago, we had a really big eruption here in New York. We have kind of low densities of crossbills in the Northeast because the forest is more of a mixed coniferous deciduous forest. But we had a big eruption of some Western types. And so I drove around on weekends for 4 months recording birds in the year that we had this once in a generation cone crop. Everything produced a massive cone crop, and tried to get at this assortative mating question. And my buddy, my collaborator and I, Tim Spar, we got up to 107 pairs, and we only had about 6 hybrid pairs. So they will make mistakes and form these hybrid pairs, but at what degree, we are not really sure yet how often they make these mistakes. I mean, if you're a type 4, which is a Western bird, and you're in the East somehow, and you don't have other type 4s there, does it behoove you to then mate with a different call type? A lot of times species or an individual will make that decision that mating with something closely related to me is better than not mating at all.
But
I hope
what I was going to say was, does that mean then that these birds who are dealing with birds that make the same call as them, are they separate species? For example, you showed the Kasha crossbill, or even, is there one in Haiti? Is there a Haitian crossbill as well?
No, not that I know of. Well, wait a second. Dominican Republic, we're talking, right? There is a white-winged crossbill that was a fascinating story, actually. That is a relict population of the boreal white-winged crossbill. So after the end of the last ice age here, which was, what was that, 10,000 years ago? I'm sorry, I might have my dates wrong on that, but there was an isolated population in Hispaniola that looked just like a white-winged crossbill. And about 15 years ago, they did some genetic work on them. They realized that this bird looks different, it has a bigger bill, has a different call than the white-winged crossbill. It feeds on pine as opposed to spruce in the boreal forest. And then they described it as a new species called the Hispaniola crossbill. So it's a similar dynamic with Kasha crossbill. Again, a very fascinating story in that Dr. Bankman, after studying the red crossbill complex for, at that point, since the early 80s, this was like I think it was 1999, he started looking at maps of lodgepole pine, which is an abundant pine species across the mountain west of the United States. Produces one of the most reliable cone crops in the world. And he said, all right, he asked himself, can I find a mountain range that is just to the east of the Rockies that has lodgepole pine that has evolved with the absence of tree squirrels? So the big driver of cone evolution are tree squirrels, actually, because they actually feed on the seeds in the cones as well. And he found these isolated mountain ranges in Idaho, and he went there, and he realized there was a local variety of lodgepole pine. There was no tree squirrels there. He went there to see if there were red crossbills, and lo and behold, there was a new call type of red crossbill. And what he started to do was, kind of a mark recapture study and banding study on that population. from 99 until, he's still doing it today. And he realized he could measure the differences in cone morphology between lodgepole pine, where there were squirrels, and where the lodgepole pine in the absence of squirrels. And what he found out was where you have squirrels, lodgepole pine will put more energy into thickening the stalk at the distal end of the cone, because the squirrels will come in and they'll bite that distal end, that stalk, and drop the cone to the ground, and that's what they feed on. You take the squirrel out of the equation in the South Hills in Idaho, and he was able to measure that the lodgepole pine in the South Hills wasn't putting its energy towards thickening that distal end of the stalk that attaches the cone to the tree. He was able to now measure that there was a significant, again, statistically significant, we're talking millimeters of changes, but he was able to show that there was a thickening of the scale in the cone. The thickening of the scale of the cone means it was actually now making the scale thicker to make it harder for the crossbill to get the seed out. So there was this kind of co-evolutionary kind of tie between, the crossbill and the changes in the morphology of the cone in that area. I have a video, if you want, I can show of white-winged crossbills feeding on cones, and you can really see the mechanism that crossbills use to feed on. You want me to show that?
Yeah, please.
I actually have it as a backdrop, so I will step away for a second and change my backdrop.
Okay. So whilst you're doing that, Matt, any of you lovely Zoomers, have you any questions you'd like to ask Matt whilst he's finding his video on the subject currently on crossbills? Okay, John Charman, I have no video to view. Well, the video's not on yet.
It is.
The video's on now.
I'm going to stay just to the outside here. But so this is a white-winged crossbill in North America, related to your two-barred crossbill. In fact, they're the same species, but different subspecies. It's about a minute and a half long, I think. So you'll see here that the bird will insert its bill perpendicular to the scale of the cone, prying it open so it can get at the seed. And then the tongue comes out, grabs the seed, and then shucks the seed from the seed coat. Pretty fascinating. They'll also twist the cone off here and then fly to a branch and almost eat it like a corn cob, just twisting, keep turning it. So the bird is turning the cone there. There is narration of this, but I figure I'd talk. Kind of narrate it myself. This was a flock that was found in, let me see, it was like 2009 when I was at the lab of ornithology, Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and we brought the videographer out, and they shot this video. Pretty incredible footage, though.
Okay, that was pretty fascinating. Let me ask a question. I mean, crossbills for a lot of us. I don't know where most of us come from actually, but I'm talking the collective we that live in the UK and maybe Europe, are birds that we don't see too often unless you go specifically to look for them in their areas. And the question I wanted to ask, because I'm still kind of trying to grapple with the idea of the different types, certainly in the US. In the UK, or in Europe, should I say, as I said, we've got the common crossbill, we've got the parrot crossbill, we've got the two-barred crossbill, we've got the Scottish crossbill, and now they're talking about the Iberian crossbill, certainly the ones in the Balearics, to be a certain different type. But I suppose the question I want to ask is, how many species are there of crossbill? And is the red crossbill the same as the common crossbill in the old world? And similarly, is the two-barred crossbill the same as your boreal two-barred crossbill?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. So the first part of that, as far as, the common crossbill and the red crossbill both share the same Latin name, Lachia curvirostra. There are as many as 11 different call types here in North America. Now, there was a paper that came out about a year and a half ago, I believe it was, in the Western Palearctic that had described as many as 27 call types across the Western Palearctic. The unfortunate thing I find, at least, is in 20 years, there have been 3 or 4 different naming systems that have been used across the Western Palearctic. And it's kind of confused the landscape in a lot of ways, in my opinion. And I think, again, I don't want to get into too much, but it gets at your question of speciation. There are clearly probably some species in some of the islands that you mentioned, Iberian areas. And so speciation in crossbills in these call types, you need kind of dynamics for that particular location for a crossbill call type to evolve to the level that reproductive barriers exist, in that they won't, breed across call type that much. So there's 2 ways that can happen, and they're really kind of closely related. But it all has to do with, island biogeography to some degree. So, across some of the islands, there's these call types that have been recognized as subspecies over in, I think, across parts of Europe. And those particular call types have evolved largely as being resident populations. So the interesting thing about the Cassia crossbill that I was describing here in Idaho is that is largely a continental locked island of sorts. The Cassia crossbill doesn't migrate, doesn't erupt like all these other crossbill call types, almost all these other crossbill call types do. So the 2 dynamics you need for speciation in crossbill call types are, you need a reliable cone crop year after year after year after year, so they aren't really forced to move around. The other one is, it's often this island kind of setting, which kind of go hand in hand to some degree. So I believe, this is my perspective on it, I'm not really a splitter by nature. I honestly believe there will be additional crossbills described, these call types or even subspecies. And again, I use that word subspecies quite a bit cautiously, because a lot of crossbills are eruptive. And so what I think goes on with these eruptive populations is there's a braiding effect that happens. When cone crops fail in the northern part of the hemisphere, where you often have more of a distribution of soft cone conifers, say spruces and hemlocks and larches, those species don't produce reliable cone crops year after year after year, typically. As you go further south, though, pine species become more common, and they tend to produce a more reliable cone crop year after year. So as you go further south across the globe, at the southern distribution of the common or red crossbill, there's a greater chance that speciation could take place because of reliability of cone crop and possible isolation from northern, more nomadic wandering populations of crossbills. In the northern populations, the cone crops will go through these boom-bust cycles, and they're forced to move. Well, what happens when they're forced to move? They come in contact with other call types. And when they come in contact with other call types, some level of hybridization exists, which keeps some level of gene flow. So they aren't ever really able to fully kind of go off on their own lineage, their own trajectory towards a full species. So I think what happens is in the northern parts of the globe where crossbill is found, you know, the large percentage of each call type for most of their lives act as good biological species because they want to mate with like call type. However, in years that the cone crop fails, they are forced to move. And so there's a subset of the population for each call type that breaks off, flies around, comes in contact with other call types, and then there's some level of hybridization. So I think the northern populations might very well never actually achieve like speciation status. It's this kind of braided, kind of suspended status where they, you know, they act as good biological species for 3 or 4 years of their life, and then a cone crop fails, they come in contact. There's gene flow there. In the southern part of the hemisphere where there's pines and there's islands, you know, those are more isolated, more resident or more stable populations of conifers or cone crops. And those can actually form or potentially become full species. I think, you know, some of the species have already been found to be monophyletic across the southern part of the distribution.
Okay.
Does that answer the question? So it's as science is, we are often describing these things, or we're trying to define these things in these fixed states. But as we know, nothing in science really is a fixed state. We're trying to put it in. We're trying to define it that way.
Yeah.
So again, it's kind of a, you know, it's a question that's going to continue to evolve. I think there's at least a handful or two of probably good, legitimate crossbills that will be described here soon or in the next few years. But a lot of them won't ever raise to that status, I don't think. I got to plug in here because my
yeah.
a little low.
Fascinating. Listen, anyone in the Zoom room, any Zoomers have any questions at all? I got a question from Hendrik. Hello, Hendrik, by the way. When hybridization between call types occurs, what happens to the calls? Do they become intermediates?
It's a fabulous question because it's been one of my so largely my answer will be no. You don't find intermediates, I don't believe, in these mixed parentage or mixed, you know, these hybrid pairs. I came across, I have all of Jeff Groff's original recordings, and he's the one that traveled all over North America doing morphometrics and doing recordings, and of a bird that literally, and we believe it was probably a mixed, a hybrid pair. It learned both call types of the parent because these are passerines. They learn their song. It's not genetically hardwired. So it learned the call type, we believe, of both of the parents. Where you find intermediates, and this is what makes crossbills and finches tricky, is because they learn their call, they go through a period of call matching when they're pairing with one another. And during period of when they pair, a pair wants to converge on a very similar call type. I'm talking even within a call type. I'm not talking across call types necessarily. So a type 1 male, picks a mate, or a female picks a mate, a type 1 with a type 1, and they'll go through a period during that mating, period where the call types for each individual will converge on one another. And that's where you get funky calls. And you get these kind of weird, intermediates or vagrants of sorts. And it's been one of my things that I've tried to press upon the Europeans. And I think, quite frankly, Magnus Robb is the one that wrote for Dutch birding the first kind of what I'd call the paper primer Bible for common crossbills in Europe. And I think he did a really good job. But what's happened since in some ways, and I don't know if it's a cultural thing to some degree, is it seems there's this desire to take every slightly different call type and put them in their own bins. And what I suspect is happening is during this period of call matching, you get these funky variants of a call type. And there's similarities in these variants. And it's very easy to go, all right, for type E, what I would define as a larger bucket for those call types, if you are recording them while they're nesting, you're going to have this call matching, and they're going to be producing these very slightly different flight calls. And it's easy to put those into each one of those into different bins and all of a sudden describe multiple call types there. Now, in the States, there was a captive study done on call plasticity in these call types. And so they had some forced pairings of 3s and 4s in the laboratory. And what they found, at least for type 3 and 4 in North America, is even during this period of call matching, there was a certain fixed amount of learning in that call type couldn't switch its call type to a entirely different call type. It would modify it some, and it would start to look very funky, but it would never fully form the same call type of its mixed pairing. Now, what I would love to see, and this is what, again, some of these studies I'd like to see become part of the Finch, research network moving forward, is some of these studies of possibly doing pairings of certain call types that are more similar to one another. 3s and 4s are pretty distinctive. So it doesn't shock me that the plasticity was somewhat limited in that it couldn't switch its call type. But I'd be very curious to see in the States here what would happen if we put, type 1 with a type 10, or type 2, I should say. Or in Europe, there's some call types that are pretty similar. And it'd be interesting to see if they could switch call type, because call switching has actually been documented in a handful of birds in Bankman's study of those birds in Cassia, Idaho. One big piece I didn't tell you when I was talking about that before is, even though that's a resident population of crossbills, What he also found was types 2s and 5s move in and out of that area regularly. And 99% of the time, they form legit pairs, meaning that like call type mates with like call type. But he has documented 5, and again, he has a banded population of over 2,000 crossbills there, including birds that move in and out of there, the 2s and 5s. But he has documented a handful of circumstances where a type 2 mated with a Kasher crossbill has actually able to change its call in the second year of pairing, post-successful breeding. So it's a very muddy system in some ways. It's a fascinating system, but as you dive into these things in science, it's often you find out that it's not this super clean kind of study that you're doing. And so that's where I've come in with analyzing these various crossbills across the world. I mean, we're actually working on a call recognition model where we hope to be able to, somebody could record a bird, drop it into a model, and it would then kind of, give you results on a confidence limit or confidence interval of what call type it is. So automating that some way would be nice because, Cornell lab ran a piece in the Living Bird where they called me the crossbill guy, and I didn't even realize this when they were doing the piece. They asked me, how many crossbills do you think you've listened to? And I estimated over 10,000 recordings. So it'd be nice to automate some of that process. I mean, I love listening to crossbills, but what I want to mainly focus on are these 5 to 10%ers where they're tricky. And I suspect that has to do with when they're pairing and when they're trying to go through this call matching period, where you get these kind of weird ones that you just have a hard time putting them into a classification, into a bin.
Yeah. Okay. I think Carolyn may have a question. I might be wrong. Am I right?
Fascinating. It's a great question, actually. Well, actually, wait a second. I see Brian's question, but you go ahead, Carolyn.
So Carolyn hasn't got one. Okay, Brian, can your call type studies be done with most finch species, or is it specific to crossbills?
It seems that there are a handful of species this might apply to. I don't believe it applies to all of the finches. They do have flight calls, but again, you need that adaptive landscape, or at least that's what we believe, and that certainly is what has been documented here in North America. There's a reason you would want to have a different call type if there's an implied ecological specialization. Now, in the United States, or again in North America, evening grosbeak has 5 different call types. That was documented back in the early 2000s by Dr. Tom Hahn and a couple of his students, Ken Sewell, Rod Kelsey. And I wrote a primer for eBird describing these call types for evening grosbeak. And again, this is an area that we hope to do some studies with Fern. And again, we want to make that about a large network of people, whether it's citizen science to academics. We want to have everybody be part of these studies, hopefully, as much as we can. But hawfinch, the same thing we believe probably occurs with hawfinch. And that's a related species to evening grosbeak here in the States. They're both Cocothrastus. So, yeah, we hope, and if you look at recordings, one of my main collaborators with Fern, there's a few of them. Tim Spar is one, Holger Klink at the lab is another one, but Patrick Franke he lives in Germany, and he did a kind of a preliminary look at hawfinches, and there seems to be a call type thing going on in hawfinches that we're very curious about. But as far as it being across all the finches, I don't believe that's the case. I think it's largely these situations where there's probably some ecological trade-off. Whereas some of these other ones, it's not, it just doesn't raise to that level, and they diversify these different call types. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay. Anyone else would like to ask a question? Okay. All right. Well, we're kind of coming to our hour. I'm going to lighten up now and ask you a couple of difficult questions. I'd like to know, for example, what is your favorite bird?
Gee, can everybody guess on that one? I mean, red crossbill is a fascinating complex. So, I mean, it's absolutely red crossbill. White-winged crossbill, though, to me, is the most beautiful. And getting back to your question about white-winged crossbill, so your two-barred and our white-wing are recognized at subspecies level. And so they are both considered Loxia leucoptera, but I believe yours is bifascia or something like that, bifasciata, which is a different subspecies than ours. But red crossbill is my most favorite bird to study. White-wing is probably my most favorite to look at.
Okay, and have you got a favorite mammal, by the way?
Absolutely. An ermine, muscellid, it's a weasel. I like the weasel family.
Good. And I know you have a love for orchids, but what is your favorite plant?
It would be an orchid. It would be the showy lady slipper, Cypripedium. Oh, geez, I'm spacing the name of it now, but that's all right. It's also called lady slipper of the queen. It's quite a beautiful. If you're familiar with lady slippers at all, that would be my favorite plant species, showy lady slipper.
Yeah, we may have to get you back to talk about orchids, actually. But
Yeah.
if you could be anywhere on this planet, notwithstanding the current pandemic, where would you be right now?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not a lover of the summer months. I would like to be somewhere across the boreal forest because I also love warblers. That's my next favorite species group after finches. I love our New World warblers. They're just absolutely gorgeous. And I love the song dialects are very, very fascinating. So I would go with Canada or, Finland or something like that.
It's funny, your New World warblers are actually not at all related to our Old World warblers. In fact, they are, thin-billed buntings, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what they're somewhat related to. Yeah, that's a big group. The passerines are a big group. But yeah, they're very different. That's what I mean. The morphological species concept is a bit interesting. It's an evolving landscape, and now we have all these genetic tests going on, and they're not related to your warblers at all. Just like the house sparrow is not related to our sparrows.
No.
Okay,
so just to give you guys a brief update on what's happening over the next few days in Conservation With. Tomorrow we've got Harriet Mead, who is an artist, and she's going to be showing us her welded sculptures that she makes out of scrap iron. It's amazing. Thursday, we have a writer called Miriam Darlington, who's written a couple of books, and she writes for the Times newspaper, and she'll be talking about her processes. Friday, we've got Stephen Moss, who is a BBC or was BBC producer. He's a man behind getting Bill Oddie on screen as a presenter. He'll be talking about the basics of nature writing because he writes a book every 2 minutes, that guy. And on Sunday, we have Tim Appleton, who is the godfather of all bird fairs in the world. And he'll be here talking about all things bird fair. So if you want to ask any questions about that, feel free.
I got a question. I mean, it's not a question, but I don't think you mentioned it at the beginning. That's actually where David and I met, was Bird Fair in 2012, I believe it was.
Wow.
Yeah, it was Bird Fair.
The Bird Fair has been the start of many long relationships. So yeah, all I want to say at this point is thank you very much, Matt, for joining us today from New York State, from America. It was very fascinating. We didn't even get onto the subject of redpolls, but we may be able to in a minute. I just want to say thank you very much for joining us, everyone, for this In Conservation With episode with Matt Young. And keep safe and keep looking up.